Greetings, this is Phil Amerson again with the To Be and Do podcast, all a part of the work of the Belonging Exchange. And so you may be picking us up with YouTube or simply through our website, which is belongingexchange.org. I am thrilled today to be speaking with a longtime friend, Bishop Ken Carter. Ken was bishop, well, most importantly in my world, he was a wonderful pastor and then was elected bishop and served in Tennessee and in Mississippi. He also was a distinguished professor at Duke Divinity School in pastoral ministry. I urge you to take a look at his recent book, Shifting Margins. Let me see if I can get it there on the screen for you. From Fear and Exclusion Toward Love and Belonging. I just finished it this morning, Ken, and welcome. It's great to have you with us, and how delighted we are to have this chance to talk.
Well, how delighted I am, Phil, to be with you. And I greatly respect and am grateful for our friendship over the years.
Indeed, indeed. Um, I, I'd like for you to explain a bit what you mean by shifting margins and how that became a theme for you I think more than this book. For you've had a website and also I think in other ways use that notion.
Yes, well, it originated from actually John Swinton. John Swinton, a pastoral theologian at St. Andrews in Scotland,
Right,
and
right.
his wonderful book that I became acquainted with in my journey with my late wife, Linda, in her dementia. Uh, John, in a lecture that he gave, it's not in his book, but in the lecture, a lecture that I heard him give, he said that Jesus did not go to the margins. Jesus shifted the margins to where those on the periphery of the societies became central to the reign and work of God. And that just struck my imagination. And as I reflected on my own life, I just felt that my whole life has been a part of that journey of shifting margins from my own growing up in Southern Appalachia in poverty, uh, in a provincialism, a very narrow, rigid religious perspective, uh, very narrow view of the world, uh, to ever expanding margins. Uh, so that, and at the center of much of my pastoral ministry, as well as my ministry as a bishop, I I tried to be constantly in touch with those people who are on society's margins. And I just felt like that perhaps that was a metaphor for the shifting of and the continuous growth in, broadening of not only relationships, which were central, but also ideas, understandings, and perspectives, ever broadening, ever the widening of the horizons, ever widening of understanding of who God is.
Right.
Beginning with a notion that I had God in a box. Well, if you got God in a box, you've got the wrong God, and therefore that life is ever expanding.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in your book, you move through several poverty and racism and our prison system and health, dementia issues, the frailty of the human reality. Um, in all of that, one of the threads that I found so interesting was the way institutions carried forward racist or privileged perspectives I appreciated, I think you quote in there Peter Story at one point, who talks about if we let the institutions do our prejudice work for us, then we can just pretend that we're not involved.
Yes, yes, my friend Peter Story, who has been one of those mentors and friends for several years. Peter said if it's easy to withdraw into our own private piety and relationship with God if we let the institution do our sinning for us.
There
Uh,
you are.
and and I have this ambivalent relationship with those institutions. They also have shaped me. They also shape us. We need them, but they also form us in diabolical ways as well. And it's easy to project our own uh, innocence onto the institutions.
So, would you consider the shifts that have gone on for you times of conversion?
Oh yes, I consider those. I very definitely so, Phil. I think of Cornelius and Peter. I've had those, and this notion. Yes, I can point to certain what I would. I can't point to one experience, but what my experience in the Methodist Church with Mrs. Mahoney, which I report in the first time I ever thought of God as being a good shepherd. Uh, I thought God was like that old landlord that held me over a barrel and threatened to drown me because he wanted me to respect his property. Uh, you know, uh, so I've shifted that over the years. So the church both gave me a new sense of direction or a new sense of meaning and purpose and sense of worth, but it also I'm caught up in uh, the weaknesses of institutions.
Well, when you told the Mrs. Mahoney story in the book, I looked down and my pages were damp. I don't know what was happening, but
Well, that was one of those formative experiences in my life, Phil. I would have to
yeah,
say, I would point to that and say, now that was a turning point in how I understood God, but it was only the beginning. That has ever been and is still expanding,
yeah,
thankfully.
yeah.
Uh, so,
And
so,
no, please
and
go
then my
ahead.
relationships, as I grew out, as I left East Tennessee and the provincialism of McKinley Road, where I grew up, and moved into seminary in Washington, D.C., 62 to 65. Boy, were those turbulent, difficult years. But that was the first time I'd lived outside for any extended period of time, even been outside East Tennessee. And there was where I first met my first African American. I hadn't
Yeah,
known any African Americans prior to that.
yeah,
Uh, but I have, so my relationships with and being confronted with race,
yeah.
with economic realities.
I found myself feeling like I was just walking about 3 years behind you, and
Mm,
so many of the experiences, including my dad was a pastor, but started on a 4-point charge that had no indoor plumbing,
hmm
and and he had actually he was from North Texas, the Panhandle, and had lived through those horrible Dust Bowl years. And I
hmm
found out later had gone to Texas Tech, living. His housing was a chicken coop,
Yeah.
and so I as you went, I never felt impoverished. I think I didn't experience uh, what you experienced having a landowner hold you over a barrel, over a tub of water, but I wasn't far from it.
hmm hmm Well, I think we all have those areas of our lives where we have felt marginalized,
You
or
know,
where we have been on the margins, and that's what I and it those experiences on the margins help to shape us, uh, and that's where I think the church belongs on the margins. That's where we, and maybe what we're experiencing in with the decline of the institutional church in the American society, we're becoming increasingly marginalized, especially the church as it's seen as an institution that addresses things like racism, economic injustices, and so forth, is increasingly marginalized and even threatened. That may be to our benefit. It may be a time of renewal and growth for us.
Let's hope. I
Let's
I
hope.
I I I, I hope that's the case. Uh, if you would share a story out of your, we're going to talk about other things in the next recording, but share us. Let's go back to the matter of racism and race. And is there a story that comes to mind that was a formative moment for you, where you saw more clearly your privilege as a white uh, person in ministry?
Yes, it was my experience in Maryland as a student pastor where I met Tom Barrington, who was the pastor of the Pleasant View Methodist Church. This was before the dissolving of the central jurisdiction, which was located just between the two churches I served. I served one church that had been the former ME Church, and the other was the former ME Church South. And between the two of those was the church in the central jurisdiction, the African American church. And I just met Tom Barrington, who was the pastor, because I just stopped there at his church one day when I saw um, a car parked, and so I met Tom, and we developed a friendship. And he was the first African American pastor. There were some students at Wesley Seminary who I became friends with as well, and they were my first African American acquaintances, really, but certainly as friends. But in the course of one of our conversations, Tom was the pastor of two churches. One was the Pleasant View Church, the other was across Gaithersburg, Maryland. And it was a larger church, it was 300 or 400 members. Um, and he had been in the pastorate he already had an MDiv degree, he was a seminary graduate. He had been in the pastoral ministry for 20 or 30 years. He was 55 years old. And I learned in one of our conversations that my salary was $300 a year more than his was. And that was, it shocked me. I mean, I had no idea. Here I was a student pastor, part time, in these two small churches. And here was a man who I respected. He was becoming a mentor and someone that I highly regarded and respected, and far more experienced and knowledgeable and skilled than I. And yet his salary was $300 less than
Wow.
mine. And that confronted me not only with my own privilege. Why should I be making $300 more than he? Only because I'm white. But it also reminded me, it was the first time I was experienced with institutional racism within the church
Right.
itself.
One of the touchstones, I read in your book, and it was for me as well, is just, well, is Second Corinthians, the fifth chapter.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Could you speak a bit about that?
Yes, that's been when I went to the Nashville area, by the way. A man came through the line and when I was being received at a reception, and he said, what would you consider to be the most formative uh, scriptural passage for you?" And I hadn't even thought of that before, but I just spontaneously said, "God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself and calling us to be agents of reconciliation."
Wow.
And I didn't know why he'd even asked the question. But if I had known you were going to ask this, I would have brought this to show
No, no,
you.
no.
But about a month later, he brought me that verse in iconography that he had done, and I have it
Wow.
framed. Uh, but that has been formative for me. That God was in Christ. Reconciliation has already taken place, and it's my responsibility. It's my call and my privilege, my invitation to live now into that reconciliation, uh,
Wow.
so that so that the divisions that we're experiencing they're the aberration uh, of history. They're the aberration of God's vision. Uh, the victory, I mean, the reconciliation has already taken place. It's
Yeah.
our matter of living into it.
Yeah. Well, I found myself thinking as I finished your book this morning, this man has lived 6 or 7 lifetimes. So much there, so many wonderful things. You've just shared with us one sacred object that gift that you were given. Is there another relic or spiritual item that comes to mind? We ask many of our guests this question.
Yes, the one that comes to mind, Phil, is one that I've carried with me. My grandfather, if you've read the book, you know that my grandfather, Granddaddy Walker, was formative in my life. He was a tenant farmer, uh, lived on welfare later in his life. I could not read nor write, but he was the man with enormous integrity, knew life. He was one of the wisest, maybe the wisest man I've known, and had a formative influence on my life. He died in 1960, 66. He was only 67 years old. But one of the gifts that my mother gave me was his pocket knife,
Uh,
which I carry much of the time. Now, this has meant a lot to me throughout my periods of transition. The margins have shifted. Now, if you see this pocket knife, you notice that one handle is off. It's the blades are hard to open. They're rusty. It doesn't cut. That's what it exists to do, isn't it? To cut. Well, what it's reminded me of over the years, it keeps me in touch with my heritage in in rural poverty of Appalachia
yeah.
and my grandfather. But at different periods in my life, it has come to be especially important. For example, when I was at Duke as a professor in that highly intellectual community, I, over my years of experience, I've come to realize that every privilege is accompanied by a blind spot,
Oh,
inevitably. And the privilege of education blinds us to the wisdom of the uneducated. So, this reminded me of a man who was wise, insightful, uh, and yet he could not read nor write. So, how do I stay in touch with those how do I access the wisdom of the unwise or the uneducated? And then, when and now it's become more and more relevant to me, and in my work with people living with dementia, including my own wife, we live in a hyper capacity oriented world where worth and value are related to our capacities, especially our rational capacities. We've bought into the Cartesian notion, I think, therefore I am. And therefore, if we can't think clearly, that means I am less. Uh, and this reminds me, the value of this knife is not in its function, not in its capacity. It can't cut. It can't produce. I can't cut it any longer like I used to, and the finish is falling off, and the joints don't work like they used to. But the reality is, all of that's irrelevant in terms of my identity and worth. My identity and worth lie in the one to whom I belong.
There
And
you
I
are.
belong to the God. I'm a part of the transcendent story of God's mighty works of salvation. And
Wow.
so it just kind of reminds me of all of that.
We want to thank you, Bishop Ken Carter, for moving us along in our own awareness that privilege is also blind spot. And for those of you that are listening, we're going to record more, and you ought to stay tuned. We're going to chat a bit in the next episode about why a Methodist bishop appreciated being called Bubba. Uh, Thank you, Ken Carter. And for those of you that are listening, this is Philip Amerson with the To Be and Do podcast. God bless.